Welcome into the Hard Count Podcast, Episode 4. Thank you for joining me today. I am your host, as always, Anthony Galler, and we have a packed show for you today on the Hard Count Podcast. I want to thank my guests from last week, Quinn and Max, for joining me. Had a great discussion with them, a lot of fun. Hope to have another special guest in the coming week. My buddy Jake will be joining me sometime next week on the next episode of the Hard Count Podcast. But you're stuck with me for today, and today we've got 4 very exciting topics. This is the NFL podcast where I'll give you one topic for each down in football. So, of course, as we know, that's 4 downs, 4 topics, and we're going to get right into it today. And we're going to start with perhaps the most discussed and perhaps the most debated news of the week in the NFL. And that was that the NFL is now implementing changes to their Rooney Rule as of yesterday. Now, the Rooney Rule, just to provide some context for those who may not know, the Rooney Rule was first implemented in 2003, and the purpose of the rule is to provide additional opportunities for minority hires, such as head coaches, assistant coaches, and basically just give minority individuals in the NFL a better chance of securing positions, whether it be head coach, again, assistant coaches, so on and so forth. So the NFL, they had a few different proposals on the table for the changes to the Rooney Rule. They implemented a few different things, but the key thing that they did not implement, which was really the thing that was highly criticized and highly debated this entire past week, was the fact that the NFL had proposed changes that would allow teams to improve their draft stock by hiring minority candidates. Now, currently, the NFL only has 4 minority head coaches, just head coaches. That's Ron Rivera of the Washington Redskins, Brian Flores of the Miami Dolphins, Anthony Lynn of the Chargers, and of course, Mike Tomlin of the Pittsburgh Steelers. So the NFL had proposed changes that would allow teams to move up 6 spots in the 3rd round of the draft by hiring a minority head coach, and by hiring a minority general manager, a team could move up 10 spots in the 3rd round for that year's draft. So again, these changes were met with heavy criticism, much debated throughout the week. Had a lot of people within the NFL world, within the sports world, within the world of entertainment, anything. A lot of people chiming in to give their opinions on these proposed changes. But for now, those ideas have been tabled. They've been pushed off to the side. They are not going to be implemented as of right now. However, the Rooney Rule is going to be expanding to a number of executive positions where teams will be required to interview minority and or female candidates as well. And teams will also be required to now interview at least 2 minority candidates for their head coaching position. No longer just 1 candidate for their head coaching position. Now you have to interview at least 2. So it's been a wild week in terms of the Rooney Rule. Lots of ideas that were brought to the table. Of course, the biggest one being having the option, or having the ability, I should say, to improve the team's draft stock. That idea is not going to happen for now, and all I can say is thank goodness. I thought this idea was lunacy when it was first announced. Not surprised at all that it was met with heavy backlash. I am a little surprised that it seemed as if everyone really animately disagreed with this idea. No matter if you were in the sports world, the NFL world, the entertainment world, didn't matter. It seemed like nobody liked this idea, and I think for good reason. You know, the NFL knows that it has an issue. That much is clear. And as I mentioned a minute ago, they only have right now 4 minority head coaches in the league, in a league of 32 teams. So the NFL recognizes this issue. It is a real issue that exists for the league, but the problem is that you sometimes, I guess you could say sometimes in life, you have the right intentions in your heart. Your heart is in the good place, but you don't necessarily have the best plan of action in place. And that's exactly what the NFL is doing here. They didn't have the best plan of action in place, even though I think their hearts were in a good place. I think of it this way. You know, if you have, I'm sure many people listening probably have siblings, and if you have a sibling, you have an older sibling or younger sibling, doesn't matter. And if you were incentivized, you know, every time you do a nice thing for that sibling, every time you do a favor for that sibling, maybe you get something, you get some type of reward. I don't know what it would be, but you get some type of reward. Well, I'd be very willing to bet that you would be much more likely to be nicer to that sibling, do a favor for that sibling, if you knew you were getting some kind of incentive out of that. And that's exactly what this felt like with the NFL, with these proposed Rooney Rule changes that could allow teams to improve draft stock. Because in this instance, you would at least, even if this weren't the truth, even if a team honestly, in the intentions of their heart, they honestly wanted to hire a minority head coaching for a position, you would still get that backlash, and you would still get those people who are saying, well, you only hired so-and-so because you know you were getting an incentive. You know you were improving your draft stock. You were going to move up 6 spots in the third round. You were going to move up 10 spots in the third round by hiring a minority general manager. So it just opens up a can of worms, I think, for the league that is really unnecessary. Because you don't want people to be saying those types of things. You don't want people to be questioning the integrity of the hire. Right now you can say, yes, we have a problem. We need more minority head coaches. We need more minority assistant coaches. We need more minority general managers. You can say all of that, but you still have to have a plan in place that really makes it so that, you don't open up this can of worms where people can say, well, they only hired so-and-so because they got a reward for it. That's not what you want it to feel like. You don't want it to feel like a kindergarten classroom where, if Johnny is nice to Timmy, he gets a juice box or he gets a box of animal crackers. You don't want it to feel like that. And that's kind of what it felt like with the NFL and these proposed changes. So I think it was really smart for the NFL to up the required number of interviews for minority head coaching candidates. That's going to be 2 instead of 1 now. And now the NFL is going to make it so that you have to interview not only head coaching candidates who are minorities, but other positions as well, other executive positions, and that's going to include female candidates as well, which I think is really nice. I think that's a really good step for the league. I think that's a really positive step, and it makes a lot of sense, but it also doesn't come with the incentive of you're doing it because X, Y, and Z. So the NFL, I think they did a lot of good things with this rule. They can still go back and revisit the idea of improving the draft stock and maybe modify it or tweak it in some way. That's still on the table. That's still a possibility. I don't know exactly how they would go about doing that, because no matter, even if you told a team they can move up 2 spots in the draft, it would still act as an incentive. That player that you get 2 spots higher could end up being a Pro Bowl caliber player, and the player that you normally would have gotten could end up being a bust. So, you just don't want to have that image of the incentive attached to it. So I think that's something the NFL has to be really careful about and be really, really cautious around going forward if they're going to make more changes to their Rooney Rule. But we're going to go into second down now. This was another huge story from throughout the past week, really. It was really a week-long story up until the past couple of days, because we had 4 in the past week, 4 NFL players who have been arrested. So it started with now Seahawks cornerback Quinton Dunbar and Giants corner DeAndre Baker. They were both arrested on charges of armed robbery, going back to an incident in Florida, going back to a party, some sort of party in Florida a couple of weeks ago, where they allegedly stole thousands of dollars worth of jewelry. Then we had Redskins wide receiver Cody Latimer, who spent most of his career with the Denver Broncos, then played a couple of seasons with the Giants, now with the Redskins. He was arrested on charges of assault and illegal discharge of a firearm. And then most recently, just a couple of days ago, we had Bills defensive tackle Ed Oliver. He was arrested because of a DWI and illegal possession of a firearm. So lots of craziness, first of all. Lots of craziness. 4 NFL arrests in the past week. Now, the NFL, fair or unfair? I think you can argue that it's fair, and I think you can also argue it's unfair, because the NFL, you think about how big an NFL roster is. Think about the NBA. An NBA, about 4 NBA rosters equals 1 NFL roster. So NFL rosters are much bigger. But having said that, I think that the NFL, it's pretty easy to recognize that the NFL does have an issue, at least the public perception is, the NFL does have an issue with, discipline and the players really acting out of line. It seems as if you always hear these stories, these crazy stories about arrests and other charges and things of that nature. You always hear these stories about NFL players. You rarely, sometimes, no doubt sometimes, but you don't often hear these stories regarding MLB players, hockey players, and even I think to a lesser extent basketball players too. But NFL players, it seems, at least from the public perception, that you always see these issues popping up. So I think that is something that the NFL again has to be very aware of, and I think that they are very aware of it. But it's something that continuously seems to pop up. And in the past week, it popped up with 4 different players, 3 different incidents, because Dunbar's and Baker's incident was really a together incident, but 3 different incidents, 4 different players with being arrested on different charges, and pretty serious charges too. I mean, none of these are traffic violations. Now, I'm not encouraging anybody to go out and commit any sort of traffic violation. That's not what I'm saying whatsoever. But these are pretty serious charges. Again, Baker and Dunbar, armed robbery. Ed Oliver, DWI, illegal possession of a firearm. Cody Latimer, charges of assault and illegal discharge of a firearm. So these are serious charges here. And I think that, in this time of the world, and, we're all going through something right now, so many things are changing around us. The world is changing around us. Just things have been thrown out of whack, but at the same time, we're all trying, or I think we all should be trying, to really come together as a collective unit in this country in order to make a positive difference, in order to do something positive for somebody else. I think that really these arrests for the NFL in the past week, they are a stain on the NFL right now. And the NFL has dealt with this in the past. They've dealt with even higher profile players than any of the guys I mentioned. They've dealt with high profile players getting in trouble for various things. I mean, without going too far into it, of course, you think about the Ray Rice incident. You think about, the Kareem Hunt incident. I mean, we're talking about guys who are star players in the league who have been, involved in criminal activities that were widely publicized throughout the media, throughout social media. So this is something that the NFL has dealt with before, certainly, and it's certainly something that Roger Goodell has dealt with before as well. But I do think, it's never a good time to commit a crime. That much we know, and that much is certain. But I do believe that especially during these times where I think a lot of us are, we're trying to come together, we're trying to do something positive for the community, we're trying to do something positive for the person next to us. I do think that it is not an encouraging sign to see from the NFL. A lot of people right now are thinking about, are we going to have an NFL season? Is there going to be NFL as we know it? We know there may not be fans. Is the season going to start on time? Is it going to start in September? Are we going to have a Super Bowl at the time the Super Bowl is going to be? So there's so many questions about the NFL just in terms of, are we actually going to play the season, or how the season is going to look? And I don't think, I think the last thing the NFL needs to be worrying about at this point, with all of that going on, I think the last thing the NFL needs to be worrying about is players being arrested, and players doing really just selfish and stupid things that get them into trouble and get their names plastered in the media for everyone to talk about, and for everyone to point a finger at the NFL and say, wow, here goes these NFL players again, just doing criminal activities and getting in trouble. So I think that, it is a stain for the NFL. It's certainly not good timing whatsoever. It never is, but I think especially considering all that's going on, it's very poor timing for all of this to be happening. I think that, in regards to Dunbar and Baker, with the Seahawks, it's such a tricky situation. You just traded for Quentin Dunbar. He was with the Washington Redskins. You just flipped a 5th rounder for him. You barely gave up anything for him. But you just got Dunbar. Hasn't played it down with your team yet. DeAndre Baker's a guy who the Giants, they drafted last year in the 1st round. Ed Oliver for the Bills. He's a guy they drafted with the 9th overall pick last year. So those are guys you want to keep around. Dunbar, he's another guy I think the Seahawks really, really want to keep around. They just traded for him. Cody Latimer, that guy, not to sugarcoat things at all, that guy's just not a very good player. He's bounced around the league. He's been to Denver, New York, now with Washington. Never been a good receiver, and never been much of a talent in the NFL. So, I think that's a guy you could probably move off of really quickly, really easily, and not feel bad about it. With Dunbar, Baker, and Oliver, it's a lot tougher because you're talking about two guys with Baker and Oliver who you just drafted, and then Dunbar, a guy you just traded for. So I think that makes it very difficult to move on from those guys. But of course, going to be a lot of controversy, I think, with those players moving forward because of these recent arrests and because of this public perception of them. So the NFL is going to have to be very careful about this. We still have months before the season is supposed to tip off, or kick off, I should say. We just have months before that's supposed to happen. So it's going to be a situation where the NFL is going to have to be very careful about how they walk this line with their players, with their public perception, with their image perception regarding all of the recent arrests in the past week. But now we're going to transition into third down today. And we're going to talk about Vikings safety Anthony Harris, who was one of the best defensive players in the NFL last year. It really was. So Vikings safety Anthony Harris, he was a free agent this offseason, but he has now agreed to sign his franchise tender with the team, which will guarantee him $11.4 million for this upcoming season. Harris and the Vikings now have until July 15th in order to reach a long-term deal. But it does sound like things are moving in a positive direction for that. Anthony Harris has made it very clear that he wants to be back with the Vikings. He wants to be a member of this team for the long run. So it sounds like things are moving in a very positive direction for that. Harris, again, he really had a breakout campaign last year. He tied for the NFL lead with 6 interceptions. He also intercepted Drew Brees in the divisional round of playoffs last year. So if you want to count postseason, he actually had 7 interceptions, which is awesome. And he was once an undrafted free agent out of Virginia, but he's really transitioned into being one of the best safeties in the NFL. And him and Harrison Smith from Minnesota, they form probably and arguably the top or one of the top safety tandems in the league. So I think this is huge for Minnesota. Minnesota this offseason, they've lost some key pieces on the defensive side of the football. They lost a few corners, actually 3 different corners. Xavier Rhodes, who's been there for a while, Mackenzie Alexander, Trey Waynes, they're all gone. Michael Pierce is gone as well. Linval Joseph. So the Vikings have lost some key talent on the defensive side of the football. So I think this was a huge move for them in order to secure Anthony Harris, to sign him to that franchise tender, and now going to be working on that long-term deal. He was, on a loaded defense. This is still a loaded defense, even when you consider the talent that they lost this offseason, this is still a loaded Minnesota defense. But Anthony Harris was one of the best players on that defense for him last season. Again, tied for the NFL lead with 6 interceptions and had 7 if you include that pick of Drew Brees in the playoffs. So I think that Anthony Harris is absolutely a stud. The Vikings should be keeping around for the long term. He's only 28 right now, so there's no reason in terms of age. There's no reason to think that he's going to regress within the next, 3 to 4 years or so. So I think that it makes all the sense in the world for Minnesota to bring him back. This defense, again, very strong unit, even considering the pieces that they've lost this offseason. Anthony Harris, too, this is a guy you just want to root for. Honestly, this is a guy you just want to root for. Like I said, he's an undrafted free agent out of Virginia. So he didn't play at a powerhouse. He didn't play at a football powerhouse program. Didn't play at Clemson, didn't play at Ohio State, Alabama, or LSU. He played at a basketball school, honestly. Virginia's known as being a basketball school, among some other sports, but they're certainly not known as being a football school. Can't even really think of too many Virginia football players who are in the NFL currently. So, you just the fact that he went to Virginia, first of all, and then second of all, the fact that he's an undrafted free agent, and now him and Harrison Smith out of Notre Dame, they're forming one of the best safety tandems in the league currently. So I think the sky's the limit for Anthony Harris. I expect another big year from him next year. And I think the Vikings, very smart to keep him around. There was a lot of chatter at the beginning of the offseason. If you go back to March, a lot of chatter and discussion that Anthony Harris could be like a sign and trade candidate, just because, Minnesota didn't know if they wanted to commit that amount of money to him. But I think for Minnesota, considering their losses on defense this offseason, and not only that, but trading away Stephon Diggs too, they really needed a bit of good news here. And they really needed to lock up one of their own for the long term. So with Anthony Harris, I think they've done exactly that. And now I look at this NFC North division heading into this 2020 season. And, I think it's going to be a two-horse race between them and Green Bay, kind of like it was last year. I look at the Bears and maybe Mitch Trubisky, this is the year that he shocks us all. Maybe, I don't know. I'm not anticipating that. Maybe this is the year he shocks us all. But I really think that the Bears are far removed from that team that they were 2 years ago. I don't think that they're the same team whatsoever. So I'm not expecting anything from Chicago. And then I think with Detroit, I like some of the pieces that Detroit has in place. And of course, they also get Matt Stafford back from that back injury. He missed half the season a year ago. And the Lions were actually playing pretty well while they had him. But I still do think the Lions have some holes in their roster that are going to prevent them from really being a challenger in that NFC North. So I do still think that the Green Bay Packers and the Minnesota Vikings are the two teams in that division. I think those are the two teams that are going to be duking it out all season long for the title. So I think for Minnesota, they're still loaded on defense. I do have some questions about their corners now that they've lost 3 corners from last year. Just how they're going to replace them and what's that going to look like heading into the season. How are they going to perform in the secondary in that aspect of things? But I still love the talent on this roster. I still think that they're a more talented roster than Green Bay, in fact. But it's just a matter of, how is Kirk Cousins going to play this season? How is Minnesota's offense going to look? I love Dalvin Cook, one of my favorite running backs. As long as that man's healthy, one of my favorite running backs. But how is that offense going to look also without Stephon Diggs? They brought in Justin Jefferson in the draft, so that was good. But I think there's still some question marks in terms of the passing attack for the Vikings. But just to bring it back to Harris for a second, love the move by Minnesota. Love that they were able to lock up one of their own. Very smart for them. And I think that now with Anthony Harris going forward, hopefully in the future, as long as they work out that long-term deal, by July 15th, I think the Vikings are going to be absolutely in a great position to challenge for that NFC North and potentially take down the Green Bay Packers. So we're going to transition now into our fourth and final topic of the day. That is going to be another player who I really was anxious to talk about. That's why I wanted to wrap up the show with him today, because Aldon Smith, yes, I'm sure you remember that name probably. Aldon Smith has now officially been reinstated by the NFL. The Cowboys, they took a chance on Aldon Smith by signing him to a 1-year conditional contract going back to April, not knowing that he would be reinstated by the league for a fact. But as of yesterday, Roger Goodell officially reinstated Smith from an indefinite suspension. It was an indefinite substance abuse suspension that was handed down in 2015. So I'm sure you remember the name Aldon Smith. Now, Aldon Smith last played for Oakland in 2015 following a very successful career that he had early on with the San Francisco 49ers. And in fact, in 59 career games prior to that indefinite suspension that was handed down 5 years ago, Aldon Smith had 47.5 career sacks in those 59 games and also forced 5 fumbles. And the other thing about Aldon Smith, too, which is really interesting that maybe some people don't know, is that despite the fact that he's been out of the league 5 years, he's only going to be 31 in September. So he's not what you would call an old player. He's certainly, someone who we don't know what to expect from him for a variety of reasons. But in terms of age, he's not in his mid to late 30s. Now, when I look at this move, first of all, when I first heard this news going back to April about the Cowboys signing or agreeing to terms with Aldon Smith on a conditional contract, I thought, wow. I mean, that was just my first reaction, just one word, wow. Because it's been 5 years since Aldon Smith was in the league. Hadn't really heard that name in a while. I knew Aldon Smith. I remember watching Aldon Smith 5 years ago when he was in the league, and really don't remember too much of him from his Raider days, but his very brief tenure with the Raiders. But going back to his first few seasons as a San Francisco 49er, I mean, this guy was one of the most disruptive and dominant forces on the defensive side of the football in the entire NFL. So when I look at this move, when I look at Aldon Smith, a 1-year contract with the Dallas Cowboys, I think this move is the ultimate. It's the ultimate Adam Dunn move. Now, here's what I mean by that. Now, Adam Dunn, if you know anything about baseball, if you're a baseball fan, maybe you're not, but I'll explain anyway. Adam Dunn was a power hitter, a baseball player who was a notorious power hitter, but he was the ultimate swing for the fences guy. And if he connected with the baseball, it was flying out of the park. But if he missed, then he was missing badly and looked pretty awkward doing it. That was Adam Dunn. That was basically Adam Dunn in a nutshell as a player. Swing for the fences every at bat. If he connects with it, it's flying out of the park. And if he doesn't, he's striking out and he looks pretty foolish doing it. That's exactly what the Dallas Cowboys are here. And that's exactly what Jerry Jones is doing here. This is the ultimate swing for the fences move. He has Aldon Smith going back to his San Francisco 49er days, which were a long time ago now. Like I already mentioned, he was one of the best defensive players in the league, regardless of position on the defensive end of the ball. He was just one of the most dominant defensive players. So we know that Aldon Smith has that capability in him as a player. But again, 5 years off. And honestly, at the very end of his Raider tenure, he wasn't playing great football like his first few years in San Francisco. 5 years, this man, and I'm of course not going to go into every single detail, but this man has gone through many different things through his life that are not just football-related things, but just things from his life outside of football, removed from the game. So you don't know what to expect from Aldon Smith whatsoever. There's no way of knowing. He is going to be the ultimate wild card in the NFL this year. I really think the two biggest wild cards in football this year, not teams, but just player perspective, I think the two biggest wild cards are Aldon Smith and Gronk. Aldon Smith and Gronk. But when I look at Gronk, Gronk's been out of the league a year. Gronk's been out of the league 1 year. And there are still many people who are skeptical of how he's going to perform, how he's going to come back. Is his body going to be in proper football shape? What's his production going to look like when he does come back? So there's still so many questions about that in regards to Rob Gronkowski. And he's only been gone a season, out of the league for a season. Aldon Smith has been out of the league for 5 seasons. He will be 31 September, which I don't believe is an old player, but it's certainly not a young player either. So there's no way of knowing what Aldon Smith is going to be for this football team. And, I think that's why, a 1-year contract, I think it was only worth like $2 million. So for Jerry Jones, that's absolutely, he doesn't care whatsoever about that. He's fine. He'll give out 1 year, $2 million contracts all day if he had to. He's worried about Dak still, unbelievably. He's still worried about Dak. That hasn't been figured out for some reason, even now. But he'll hand out 1 year, $2 million deals all the time if he could. So that's not an issue, but just the perception of it is, he's going to take heat for this. I think if it doesn't work out. If it doesn't work out and Aldon Smith is terrible, or if something happens where Aldon Smith, is certainly not hoping for this, certainly not wishing for this, but if something happens where Aldon Smith is suspended by the league again for one reason or another, it's going to look pretty bad optic-wise for the Cowboys. Having said that, it's the Adam Dunn move. It's the ultimate Adam Dunn move. If Aldon Smith somehow does come back, his body's in proper football shape, his mind's in the right place too. It's mind and body. It's both of those together. And if he's able to do that, and let's say Aldon Smith has a very productive season, then it's going to look like an absolute steal. It's going to look like an absolute steal. It's going to look like a home run for Jerry Jones. It's going to look like a home run for the Dallas Cowboys. So that's why it's the ultimate wild card. But I do think that it's utterly fascinating. No matter what happens, you don't have to be a Cowboys fan. I think that if you're just a football fan, if you're just a sports fan, I think it's absolutely fascinating to see what's going to happen with Aldon Smith this season. Is it going to be the ultimate triumph, or is it going to be an absolute mess and an absolute failure? I'm certainly not wishing that on him, but it could be a possibility, and that's just something you have to acknowledge and something you have to be aware of. But I'm very excited to see Aldon Smith back. It's just like I haven't seen this guy really in his prime, his peak season in San Francisco. That was like 2012, 2013, maybe 2014. But, just the fact that he hasn't been in the league 5 years, it's just kind of like bringing up a name from the past that you almost forgot about, honestly. So very, very intrigued to see how it's going to all play out for Aldon Smith this year, how it's going to play out for the Cowboys. I don't know what he's going to be able to give the Cowboys. It's really a toss-up because we know the talent is there. We know how dominant he was as a 49er. But at the same time, that does feel like it was ages ago. So it's just really hard to tell, and that's why I think it's the ultimate Adam Dunn move. And I think that's if you know Adam Dunn, I think the type of player that he was, I think that's the proper way to describe it. But yeah, so that's going to actually do it for me today on the Hard Count podcast. Hope you enjoyed this episode. Like I said at the top of the podcast, next time on the Hard Count podcast, hopefully going to be having my friend Jake on to provide his perspective, provide his opinions, and really enjoyed having my special guest last week on the show. So that's going to do it for me today. Take care. Take it easy. I will see you next time from the gridiron. It'll be the Hard Count Podcast, episode 5. So long